My fiancée rolled her eyes and said, "You'll never fit into the world I want to live in." I calmly removed the ring and walked away. A year later, she sat frozen after seeing my company open its new headquarters in the city she once left me for. "You're a good man, Brent, but you'll never fit into the world I want to live in." She said it the way someone announces the weather. Flat. Certain. Already decided. I remember the exact temperature of the room. That particular cold that doesn't come from air conditioning, but from the sudden absence of something warm. The apartment we'd shared for 2 years had never felt smaller. The throw pillows she'd picked out from that overpriced boutique on Prince Street sat perfectly arranged on the couch behind her. The framed photo of us at her sister's wedding leaned against the bookshelf at an angle she'd said was intentionally casual. Everything in that apartment had been chosen, curated, including, I was realizing, me, and I had apparently not made the final cut. I looked at her face. Whitney Chun, 31 years old, senior associate at one of the most prestigious financial consulting firms in Manhattan, owner of a jaw that could cut glass and a smile that had once made me feel like the luckiest man alive. She was wearing her work blazer, even though it was a Saturday. She had started doing that lately, keeping the armor on even at home. She didn't look angry. That's what I keep coming back to, even now. She looked like someone who had finally gotten around to a task on their to-do list. "Whitney, I've been thinking about it for a while." She set her wine glass down, barely touched. "I think I owe you honesty more than I owe you comfort." There were 100 things I could have said, questions I could have asked, arguments I could have made. I had, after all, been the man who'd learned the names of all her colleagues, who'd shown up to every firm event in a suit I couldn't quite afford, who'd spent 2 years quietly reshaping himself around the edges of a life she was building. Instead, I looked down at my left hand. The engagement ring she'd helped pick out, because, she'd said, she knew what she liked, was sitting in a small velvet box on the kitchen counter. She'd placed it there before she started speaking. I hadn't registered it until that moment. She had planned this. She had set out the box before she even said the words. I picked it up, opened it, looked at the ring inside. A simple band with a channel-set diamond, tasteful, exactly her preference. And then I closed the box and set it back down, gently, on her side of the counter. "Okay," I said. "Just that." "Okay." I picked up my jacket from the hook by the door. The same hook I'd installed on a Sunday afternoon while she read on the couch and told me 2 inches to the left. No. Right. No. Actually, the first place was fine. And then I walked out. I didn't slam the door. I didn't say anything cutting. I didn't give her the dramatic scene that might have, at least, made a better story. I just left. I would later understand that this was the only thing I did in that entire relationship that genuinely surprised her. What I haven't told you yet is what happened a year later. A year later, Whitney Chun would be standing on a sidewalk in Midtown Manhattan, surrounded by the kind of people she'd spent years engineering her life to impress, and she would look up at a building, a glass and steel tower with a lobby full of light, and a company name etched in brushed aluminum above the entrance. And she would go completely, utterly still. Because the name on that building would be mine. Not mine in the way a client's name is yours, or a boss's name is yours after years of service. Mine the way a thing is yours when you built it from nothing, when you stayed awake in a sublet studio in Bushwick arguing with yourself about whether any of it was worth it, when you failed 3 times before you figured out how to succeed once. I won't tell you how it happened yet. That's the part that takes a year to understand. There was a version of us that worked. I want to be honest about that, because it would be easier, cleaner, to say that the signs were always there, that I should have seen it coming, that Whitney was always the person she became. But that's not true, and I think the truth matters more than the comfort of a simple story. I met Whitney at a mutual friend's birthday party in the fall, for years before the ring box on the counter. She was arguing with someone about a documentary neither of them had actually finished watching, and she was so confidently, cheerfully wrong that I walked over just to see how it would end. It ended with her laughing at herself, which was the thing that got me. People who can laugh at themselves at 30 are rare. I've since learned they become rarer as they get more successful. We dated for a year before we moved in together. She was a junior associate then, working 70-hour weeks and surviving on bodega coffee and the particular energy that comes from believing you're exactly where you're supposed to be. I was running the operations side of a mid-sized logistics software company. Nothing glamorous, but solid. Good salary, good work, the kind of job where you know exactly what you've built at the end of every day. We were happy in the way people are happy when they're too busy to examine it closely. Weekends at the farmer's market. Arguments about whose turn it was to call the super. A running joke about a cat we were never going to get that somehow had a name, Gerald, and a whole imagined personality. She was promoted to senior associate 18 months into our relationship. I took her to dinner at the restaurant she'd been wanting to try in the West Village, the one with the 2-month wait list, and I watched her face over candlelight and thought, she's going to be extraordinary. I meant it without reservation. I still mean it, actually. Whitney is extraordinary at what she does. It's just that what she does eventually included deciding who was worth keeping. The changes came the way most changes do, invisibly, until suddenly you can't unsee them. First, it was the friend group. Her work friends had always existed in the background of our relationship, the way colleagues do, present in stories and occasionally in person at happy hours I'd pop into briefly before heading home. But after the promotion, they moved to the foreground. Lindsay Park and Carrie Weston especially. Lindsay was a vice president, 2 years older than Whitney, with the kind of precise beauty that looked expensive to maintain. She wore her ambition openly and seemed to regard it as a character trait rather than a flaw. Carrie was newer to the firm but was adapting quickly, the way people adapt when they've identified the current of the room and decided to swim with it. I didn't dislike either of them, not at first. I was friendly. I asked questions about their work. I laughed at their jokes. But I noticed things. Small things. The way Lindsay's eyes moved to my clothes when we met at a firm event. Not obviously, just a quick inventory, a silent calculation. The way Carrie would reference things obliquely, inside jokes and callbacks that predated me, that made Whitney turn toward her slightly, away from me. The way a plant angles toward light. The way Whitney, afterward, would not mention these moments. Not to reassure me. Not to acknowledge them. Just silence, which I told myself was nothing. It wasn't nothing. The promotion changed Whitney's calendar first, and then it changed her face. There was a version of her face that had been mine. Open, a little tired, quick to smile at small things. The face she brought home at the end of a hard day, the one that existed without an audience. After the promotion, that face became rare, like a season that arrives late and leaves early. The new calendar was full of things I was adjacent to, but not quite inside. Networking dinners at restaurants I couldn't expense. Client events at venues where the bar minimums were higher than my weekly grocery budget. Industry conferences where the conversation moved at a register I couldn't naturally access. Not because I wasn't smart enough, but because I hadn't spent a decade building fluency in the specific language of high finance. I went to some of them. Whitney invited me, in the way you invite someone when you're not entirely sure you want them there, but you don't want to be the person who didn't invite them. I want to be fair about this. It was uncomfortable for me, but the discomfort wasn't about money. I want to be precise here because I think people assume these stories are about wealth, and this one wasn't. I made a decent living. I wasn't embarrassed by my salary. The discomfort was more like walking into a conversation that had been going for years and trying to find the moment to join, except the people already talking were subtly, professionally skilled at not leaving moments. Lindsay was the worst or the best, depending on how you look at it. She never said anything unkind directly. She asked me questions with a warmth that had nothing behind it. And what is it you do, Brent? Operations, fascinating. So more the back-end side of things. Said the way you might describe a necessary but unglamorous function of an otherwise impressive machine. Carrie took her cues from Lindsay, which meant she watched me the way you watch something you've been told isn't interesting. Whitney stopped defending me. That's the part one noticed most. Not that they were subtly unkind. People at that level are subtly unkind for sport. It's practically a job skill. It was that Whitney, who had once laughed at people who organized their social lives by status, who had once looked me in the eye over bad takeout, and said she found the whole game exhausting. She stopped pushing back. She'd laugh along at the edges of jokes I wasn't invited into. She'd redirect conversations away from me with the practiced ease of someone who decided avoidance was kinder than confrontation. I started noticing a particular silence between us. The kind that lives in the 6 inches between two people in bed. I told myself I was imagining it. My friend Derek, who had known me since college and who had met Whitney twice and formed an accurate opinion of the situation roughly 8 months before I did, told me plainly one afternoon in March, "She's auditioning for a different life, man. You're not in the cast." I told him he was being dramatic. He was not being dramatic. There was a moment, a specific, small, ordinary moment, that I think was the hinge point, the thing I should have read clearly and didn't. We were at a gallery opening, one of Whitney's firm's client events, abstract paintings that none of us were looking at very hard. She was across the room talking to a partner from another firm, a man whose name I'd heard referenced at home as important in a way that felt like a category rather than a description. She was laughing at something he said. Good laugh, easy, the kind she used to reserve for things that actually struck her as funny. She glanced across the room and found me. For 1 second, something complicated crossed her face. Not unkindness, exactly. More like seeing me through someone else's eyes. Assessing, and not liking the assessment. She looked away first. I stood by the bar for another 20 minutes before she came back over. Ready to head out? She said. Sure, I said. We took a cab home in silence. Neither of us mentioned it. The firm's annual corporate gala was held in April, 6 weeks before the ring box on the counter. It was at a hotel in Midtown I'd walked past 100 times without having a reason to go inside. The kind of lobby that announces its own expense quietly, marble and height, and the specific hush of a space that has been paid to feel significant. Whitney had spent the week before talking about it with the particular stress of someone who has made an event both very important and a source of anxiety. Guest lists, seating arrangements, who was presenting which award, which partners would be there. She went through 3 potential outfits the Sunday before and landed on a midnight blue dress that made her look, I told her honestly, genuinely stunning. She smiled at the compliment with a small delay, like an echo. My friend Chad had connected me to someone at the firm a year earlier, a referral that had nothing to do with Whitney and everything to do with a project they'd needed outside perspective on. I'd done solid work. A few people there knew my name in a context other than Whitney's fiancé. I'd hoped, quietly, that this might help. Make me less of an accessory and more of a person in the room. It didn't work the way I'd hoped. We arrived and Whitney moved through the room with a fluency I found genuinely impressive. She was in her element in a way that was easy to admire, connecting with the right people, remembering names and contexts, doing the delicate work of navigating hierarchies without making it visible. She was good at this. I'd always known she was good at this. What I hadn't fully absorbed was that I wasn't part of the skill set. She introduced me to people the way you introduce something you're not entirely sure about. This is Brent. We've been together a few years. Not, this is my fiancé. The engagement was 4 months old. She wasn't lying. She just wasn't including the thing that was most true. I noticed. I kept my face neutral and shook hands and answered the polite, disinterested questions people asked when they've already moved on to the next conversation. I realized, invisible in the specific way that only happens in rooms where visibility is the entire currency. Chad was there. I hadn't expected to see him. His firm had some business relationship with Whitney's, and he'd landed on the invite list. He found me near the bar during the cocktail hour and said, in a low voice, "You good?" "I'm fine," I said. "Why?" He looked at me for a moment with the expression of someone who knows something they're not sure you want to know. "Just checking in," he said. "Chad." "Later," he said. "We'll talk later." He was watching something over my shoulder as he said it. I turned, but there was only the usual crowd, clusters of expensive suits and practiced conversation. The dinner was long. I sat at a table where I knew no one well and made the kind of conversation you make when you're fluent in politeness, but not in the specific dialect being spoken. A woman across from me was describing a restructuring deal with an animation that suggested she expected me to be familiar with the parties involved. I nodded in the right places. Whitney, at the same table, didn't look at me for most of the meal. The awards portion of the evening was when it happened. An executive introduced to the room as someone whose name I should apparently know was presenting a leadership award, and in his remarks he mentioned our rising stars, and he looked directly at Whitney as he said it. And everyone at the table turned to her with the warm, competitive admiration of people who are impressed but also noting the threat, and Whitney's face in that moment was the most alive I'd seen her in months. She caught me watching her, and for just a second, half a second, a fraction, I saw something that looked like pity, not cruelty. Pity is distinct from cruelty. Pity is what you feel towards something you used to think could keep up. On the cab ride home, she was quiet and bright. The particular brightness of someone processing something positive. I sat beside her and understood, without being able to articulate it yet, that something had been decided. 2 mornings later, she asked me to sit down. "You're a good man, Brent, but you'll never fit into the world I want to live in." I've been back to that sentence 100 times, maybe more. The strange thing is how carefully constructed it was. It begins with something true. She did, I think, genuinely believe I was a good man. She wasn't lying about that. But the structure of the sentence uses that truth as a foundation for the thing she actually wants to say, which is, goodness isn't the relevant metric here. She was sitting across from me at the kitchen table, coffee going cold between us. A Saturday morning in May, city noise drifting up from the street below, everything ordinary outside the window. I remember thinking, in a very calm and detached way, that this was the conversation I had been not having for months, the one that had been living in the silence. And some part of me, some very tired part, was almost relieved that it was finally taking up space. I've been doing a lot of thinking, she continued. She had a speech prepared. I could tell by the cadence. Not written down. Whitney was too controlled for that, but rehearsed. She'd stood in front of the bathroom mirror and run through it, probably more than once. About where I'm going. What the next 5 years look like. The kind of life I want to build. And I'm not in it, I said. A pause. Something flickered across her face. Surprise. Maybe. That I'd gotten there so quickly. It's not about you not being enough. As a person. Just not the right person. The world I'm moving into, she stopped. Started again. The people I need to build relationships with, professionally and personally, it requires a certain alignment. Of ambition. Of presence. Of social standing, I said. She didn't correct me. There it was. In the absence of a correction, the whole thing. I sat with it for a moment. The apartment was very quiet. I was aware of the particular quality of morning light coming through the east-facing window, the kind that doesn't last long. I'm not angry, I said, and I meant it. I want you to know that. Brent. I'm not. I'm not going to yell. I'm not going to make a scene. I looked at the ring box, still on the counter where she'd placed it. I just want to understand one thing. Was any of it real? The beginning. Was that real? She looked at me for a long moment. Her jaw did something complicated. Yes, she said. That was real. I believed her. I still do. The beginning was real. It was the middle that changed, slowly and then all at once. I stood up, walked to the counter, picked up the ring box, and turned it over in my hands for a moment. The velvet was a deep charcoal. I'd always thought it was an unusual choice, a little different from the standard red or black. She'd picked it herself. I set it back down gently, the right way up, on her side of the counter. Take care of yourself, I said. I picked up my jacket. I walked out. The sound of the door closing behind me was the quietest thing I'd ever heard. I walked down the 4 flights of stairs without stopping, through the lobby, past the super who nodded without looking up, out the front door, onto the sidewalk. The city was doing what the city does, going about its business with complete indifference to whatever happens to any single person inside it. A delivery bike shot past. Someone was arguing on the phone at the corner. The bodega across the street had its usual fruit display out front, mangoes and peaches in careful rows. I stood on the sidewalk for a long moment. And then, because there was nothing else to do, I started walking. If you enjoy real stories like this, subscribe, because what happened next changed everything for me. I need to tell you about the week after, because the week after is important and people skip it. The week after is the part where the adrenaline of the clean exit wears off, and what's left is just the fact of what's gone. The Sunday mornings. The way she'd read articles aloud that she found interesting. The specific laugh she made when she was genuinely surprised by something funny. The small domestic rhythms. Her coffee on the left, mine on the right. Gerald the imaginary cat asleep somewhere between. I stayed with Derek for a few nights. He made food I didn't taste and put basketball on that I watched without registering. He didn't say I told you so, which was the only version of kindness that would have worked. On Thursday, I signed a lease on a studio in Bushwick. 5th floor, no elevator, a window that looked onto a fire escape and beyond that someone else's fire escape. The walls were white in the way rental walls are white, without commitment. I lay on the floor the night I moved in. The mattress hadn't been delivered yet, and looked at the ceiling. I thought, she's not wrong that I don't fit into her world. And then I thought, but I could build my own. It was a small thought, arriving in a very quiet room. I don't want to pretend it arrived with clarity or confidence. It arrived the way most important things do, as a question, not an answer. As a maybe, not a yes. But it arrived. The year that followed was not a montage. I want to be accurate about this because the story of rebuilding tends to get told in highlights. The first win, the breakthrough, the moment things clicked, and the honest version is mostly the parts between those moments. The long stretches that don't resolve, don't build cleanly toward anything, don't feel like anything except time passing while you're trying to figure out what you're supposed to be doing. I kept my job at the logistics software company for the first 3 months. Showed up, did the work, came home to the Bushwick studio and ate dinner at the kitchen counter. No table yet, and opened my laptop and stared at spreadsheets and business plans and market analyses until I couldn't hold my eyes open. The idea wasn't new. That matters. I had been sitting on it for almost a year before everything with Whitney ended. A gap in the logistics software market. Mid-tier supply chain companies had enormous inefficiencies that enterprise solutions were too expensive to solve and small business tools weren't equipped to handle. The middle tier was underserved and nobody was building for them specifically. I'd seen it from the inside, living in the operational reality of exactly the kind of company that needed this. I'd talked to Whitney about it once, early on, when the idea was just an idea. She'd been encouraging in the way people are encouraging when they're not really listening. That sounds really interesting, babe. Subject changed. I put it away. After I left her apartment that Saturday morning in May, I took it back out. Derek was the first person I told properly. We were in his apartment in Crown Heights for weeks after the breakup, and I walked him through the concept with a whiteboard marker and his kitchen wall. He said I could, which is the kind of friendship that matters. Derek was a project manager by trade and a skeptic by nature, which meant his version of support was a long list of every problem with the idea. The market was fragmented. The sales cycle for this kind of B2B product was long. I'd need technical co-founders, and I didn't have them. The runway required was significant. So it's possible, I said. I didn't say impossible, he said. I said hard. Those are different things. He looked at the wall, looked at me. Yeah, he said. They are. Travis came in 6 weeks later. Travis Okafor, who I'd known since the logistics company where he'd been the lead developer and I'd been the operations manager, who'd left a year earlier to freelance and who I called on a Tuesday night without much of a plan. I have an idea, I said. Is it good? He said. I don't know yet, I said. That's partly why I'm calling you. He came over the following weekend with a bag of food from a Jamaican place in his neighborhood and his laptop and an opinion about everything, which was exactly what I needed. We stayed up until 3 in the morning arguing about architecture and market positioning and whether the name I had for the company sounded like a company or like a clever idea for a company, which are different things. We decided it was a real company. We called it Meridian. The first 6 months of Meridian were humbling in the way that real things are humbling, which is to say they required me to understand that confidence is not the same as competence and competence is not the same as execution, and execution requires a tolerance for failure that I had to develop in real time. We applied for 2 accelerator programs. Got into neither. We pitched 12 potential early investors. Got meetings with 3. Got a check from 0. We built a prototype that Travis and I were genuinely proud of and showed it to 6 mid-tier logistics companies who told us, politely or not so politely, that it didn't quite solve their problem, or it solved the wrong problem, or it solved the right problem, but not the way they wanted it solved. We rebuilt. There were nights, I won't pretend otherwise, when the Bushwick studio felt very small, and the ceiling felt very low, and the distance between where I was and where I'd imagined being felt like the kind of geography that doesn't have roads through it. I thought about Whitney sometimes during those nights. Not with longing, exactly. More with a particular focused clarity about what she had meant when she said I didn't fit into her world. She'd been right that I didn't fit into her world. She'd been wrong that there was only one world worth fitting into. Chad became important during this period in a way I hadn't expected. We'd been friends since college, me and Chad, but the way college friendships sometimes go, we drifted into parallel tracks that intersected a few times a year, reliably, but not deeply. He worked in private equity, which meant he spent his days doing something adjacent to what I was building, but from a different angle. And after the breakup, he started showing up more, calling on random evenings, suggesting beers on short notice, the particular attention of a friend who has decided you need watching. I asked him once, maybe 4 months after the breakup, what he'd been about to tell me at the gala. He'd said later. We'd never gotten to later. He looked at the table for a moment. There was someone she was spending time with, he said carefully. From the firm. Not a partner. Someone being positioned. Connected family. The kind of network you can't build, you have to be born into. Okay, I said. It might have been nothing, he said. I didn't know for certain, but you had a sense. I had a sense. I sat with that for a while. It stung, which I suppose it was always going to. But it also, strangely, completed a picture I'd been looking at with a missing piece. The way you finally see the shape of something when all the edges are in. Her loss, Chad said. Yeah, I said. I don't know if I believed it then. I believed it later. The turn came in month 8. Not a dramatic turn. Not a movie turn. A real turn. which means it looked, from the inside, like one more attempt that might or might not work. A company called Hartwell Distribution, based in Newark, had been recommended to us by a contact of Derek's. Mid-sized, third-generation family business, the exact profile of company we'd built Meridian for. They'd been having supply chain visibility problems for 2 years and had tried 2 different software solutions that hadn't fit. Travis and I drove to Newark on a Tuesday in January. The meeting was in a conference room that smelled like old coffee and had a whiteboard with something written on it from a previous meeting that no one had erased. The operations director, a man named Frank Belletti who'd been with the company for 22 years, looked at us with the particular patience of someone who has heard pitches before and has been disappointed before and is prepared to be disappointed again. We spent an hour with him. We asked more questions than we answered. We listened to his problems. Actually listened, not listening to respond. And then we showed him exactly, specifically, precisely what we'd built to solve those problems. Frank Belletti looked at the demo for a long time without saying anything. "You built this for companies like mine," he said finally. It wasn't a question. "Yes," I said. He looked at it a little longer. "What's your implementation timeline?" he said. Hartwell Distribution signed with us in February. 2 weeks later, a company they'd referred us to signed. By April, we had 7 clients. By June, 1 year and 1 month after I walked out of that apartment in the West Village, Meridian had raised a seed round from a VC firm that Derek had introduced us to, enough to hire 6 people and begin the phase we'd been calling, between ourselves, the real beginning. We started looking for office space. Not in Newark, not in Brooklyn, not anywhere that felt like hiding. We started looking in Manhattan. I found out some of what happened on Whitney's side from sources I won't fully detail. Mutual friends, professional overlap, the particular osmosis of information that happens in a city where everyone's networks are closer than they look. Some of it I understood without needing to be told. I knew Whitney. I'd spent 4 years learning the architecture of how she thought, and once you understand the architecture, you can extrapolate. Whitney Chun had grown up in a household where success was the oxygen and its absence was a kind of suffocation. Her father had built a business from nothing and spent the rest of his life making sure everyone knew it. And her mother had spent the same years managing the social reality of that success with the efficiency of someone who'd made it her career. Whitney grew up understanding, from an early age, that the world came in gradations and you were always either rising or falling, and standing still was not a neutral option. She was brilliant. I want to say that clearly because it's true and because it's relevant. She hadn't gotten to where she was by accident or by connection. She'd gotten there by being genuinely, fearfully good at the work. She could see the shape of a problem before most people had finished describing it. She could navigate complexity the way some people navigate familiar streets, with an ease that looked effortless and wasn't. The problem, or one of the problems, was that the firm she worked for had its own gravitational field, its own definition of the right life, and Whitney had been moving through that field for long enough that she'd started to take its shape. Lindsay Park was the center of that gravitational field, in social terms. Not the most senior person at the firm, but the person who had decided what the culture of success looked like at that particular altitude, and who enforced that culture with the cheerful efficiency of someone who'd made the climb and wanted company in a very specific form. Lindsay had decided, at some point in the year before everything ended, that I was the wrong kind of person for Whitney's life. Not bad, not offensive, just wrong category. The kind of man you date before you understand what's available to you. She had not said this directly. Lindsay was too skilled for directness. She'd said it in the way she'd looked at me, in the way she'd asked her questions, in the way she'd steered conversations to territories I couldn't navigate, in the way she'd laughed warmly at Whitney's jokes while I was mid-sentence. And Whitney, who knew better, who had once known better, had let her. That's the part one had to spend a long time not being angry about. Not the fact of it, which I could understand even if I couldn't fully excuse, but the particular shape of it. Whitney had seen what was happening. She wasn't unaware. She'd made a choice, slowly and then completely, to let the current carry her rather than swim against it. The man Chad had referenced, his name was Preston, I learned later, which is the kind of name that comes with a certain kind of background, was part of the current. Family money, extended network, the right last name at the right dinner tables. Whitney had, I gathered, spent several months navigating something between professional proximity and personal interest, orbiting the possibility without landing on it. I don't know what happened between them. I don't need to know. What I understand is this. Whitney had looked at her life and seen a version of the future that had a shape she recognized, that fit the template she'd grown up understanding as successful, and she'd moved toward it with the same efficiency she brought to everything else. What she hadn't calculated, what I don't think it occurred to her to calculate, was that the person she'd edited out might turn out to be building something she hadn't imagined. That's the thing about judging potential by the evidence in front of you. It only works if the person in front of you has finished becoming who they're going to be. Meridian Operations Software. That was the full name. We used Meridian for everything casual, but the full name mattered to me because operations was in it, because that was what we did and what I'd always done and what I'd spent years understanding from the inside. And I wasn't interested in hiding the unglamorous parts anymore. The seed round had given us runway. The first 7 clients had given us proof. The 8 months between those two things had given us something harder to quantify, a product that actually fit the market we were building for, sharpened by real feedback from real problems, without the theoretical elegance of something built in a vacuum. We hired our first 6 people in the spring. Travis ran product and engineering. Derek came on as head of operations. Fitting, he said, with the dry humor he deployed for things he actually cared about. We brought in a head of sales named Moira who had 20 years of B2B experience and an immediate, almost impatient sense of what the company could become and what was getting in the way of it getting there faster. Moira was the person who told me, in July, that we needed to talk about New York. We're operating out of a converted space in Brooklyn, she said, in the particular tone she used when she was about to be direct in a way I wouldn't necessarily enjoy. Our clients are coming to us. Our prospects are coming to us. Our potential partners and investors are coming to us. And every time they come to us, they walk into a space that says, promising early stage company. We are a promising early stage company, I said. We're past that, she said. The story has changed. The space should change. She wasn't wrong. I'd known she wasn't wrong before she said it. We started looking at space in Manhattan in August. The real estate conversations alone were their own education. The way Manhattan commercial real estate operates involves a particular combination of patience and aggression that I had to learn on the fly. The broker we worked with was named Sandra, an extremely efficient woman in her 50s who asked us 4 questions in our first meeting and then proceeded to show us exactly the right spaces without wasting either of our time. The building on 49th Street was the 3rd one she showed us. It was bigger than we'd been planning for. I almost said no. The instinct of someone who'd spent a year watching every dollar was to take the practical option. Moira looked at the space for about 3 minutes, walked to the window that looked over the city, and turned around. This is it, she said. We're not ready for this, I said. You will be, she said, by the time the lease starts. She was right, again. She had an irritating habit of being right. We signed in September. The renovation took 4 months. Commercial build-outs in Manhattan take as long as they take, and no amount of urgency changes that, something I accepted after about 6 weeks of not accepting it. By the time January arrived, we had a space that looked like what we were becoming. Not a startup playing at being a company, but a company. The lobby had our name on the wall in brushed aluminum. Meridian. I'd driven past the building during the construction, sometimes in the evenings after everything else was done. I'd look up at the facade from the sidewalk below and think about the gap between where I was and where the building said I was going. It never felt real until it did. We planned an opening event for the week the space was complete. Not a gala. Nothing like that. I had complicated feelings about galas, but a proper launch. Press. Clients. Partners. Investors. The people who'd taken a chance and the people who hadn't and were now paying attention. Moira handled the invitations. She was the kind of person who understood that the guest list is the event. I didn't know who she'd invited until the night itself. The evening was a Thursday in February. I arrived early because I always arrive early. It's a compulsion, and I stood in the lobby of the building before anyone else was there and looked at the logo on the wall. Meridian. My name was not on the building. We talked about it. Some companies do that. The founder's name on the door, the personal brand woven into the company brand, and I'd decided against it. Meridian was bigger than me. It was supposed to be bigger than me. I hadn't spent a year building a monument to my own ego. I'd spent a year building something that solved real problems for real companies, and that thing had its own name. The guests started arriving around 7. Frank Belletti from Hartwell was there, with his operations team, with the particular warmth of a client who has been with you from the beginning and knows it means something. The VC partners. Sandra, the broker, who looked around the finished space with the satisfaction of someone whose judgment has been confirmed. Moira, already working the room with the efficiency of someone who is never actually at parties, only ever at work that looks like a party. Derek found me by the window around 7:30, the same window Moira had stood at in August. "You did this," he said. "We did this," I said. "Don't deflect," he said. "You did this." I looked out at the city for a moment. The particular light that Manhattan has in February, cold and clear and entirely indifferent to sentiment. "Yeah," I said. "We did." I wasn't prepared for what happened next, because Moira hadn't told me. I was talking to a journalist from a trade publication. He was writing something about mid-market logistics technology. Meridian had come up as a company worth covering, and I was mid-sentence when I saw Chad, across the room, make a face I recognized. The face was, "This is about to get complicated." I turned, following his line of sight. Whitney was standing in the entrance to the lobby. She looked the way she always looked. That's the first thing I registered. The way your mind anchors to the familiar before it processes the extraordinary. The dark blazer. The precision of her. The way she carried herself in a room, already reading it. Beside her were Lindsay and Carrie. And another woman I didn't recognize, Heidi. I learned later, a newer addition to their circle, same firm, same orbit. I understood immediately. Moira had done her homework on who mattered in the financial consulting world in New York, and Whitney's firm mattered, and their senior people were on the list, and Moira hadn't known, or hadn't considered, or had considered and decided it was worth whatever happened next. I watched Whitney's face. She was already looking at the logo on the wall when she came in. She might have seen it on the building, outside, before she entered, I don't know. But she looked at the wall, and she read the name, and something happened in her expression that I had to watch carefully to see because she controlled it quickly. But not quickly enough. For a second, a full second, not a fraction, she went still. Not frozen. She didn't stop moving her body. But there's a kind of stillness that happens behind the face, behind the eyes, when the brain is processing something it hadn't prepared for. When the story you'd been telling yourself collides with something that doesn't fit the story. Lindsay, beside her, said something. Whitney didn't respond for a moment. Then she recovered, turned to Lindsay, said something back, smiled, kept moving into the room. She was very good. She had trained herself to be very good at exactly this. But I had spent 4 years learning the architecture of how she thought, and I had seen the second before the recovery. I went back to my conversation with the journalist. I answered his questions. I told him the story of Meridian, the real version, the one with the 18 rejections and the rebuilt prototype and the Frank Belletti meeting in Newark, because I decided early on that the sanitized version of the story served no one and the honest version was actually more interesting anyway. Carrie found Chad first, because apparently they had some professional overlap I hadn't known about, and their conversation was across the room, but I could see Chad's particular quality of attentiveness that meant he was handling something carefully. Lindsay made a slow circuit of the room, reading it the way she read every room, and ended up near the bar talking to one of our investors. She asked good questions. I'd say that about Lindsay. She was actually smart, not perform smart. She would have been interesting in a different geometry. Heidi looked around the space with the open expression of someone who hadn't loaded it with history. And Whitney. Whitney moved through the room for almost 40 minutes before she worked her way to me. I watched the approach because I had time to. She was deliberate about it, not avoiding me, exactly, but giving herself time, making other conversations first, building towards something. When she arrived, she was wearing the version of her face I knew best, composed, direct, a little warmer than her default because the situation called for warmth. "Brent," she said. "Whitney," I said. "Congratulations," she said. What you've built is impressive. Genuinely." "Thank you," I said. "Meridian." She said the name as if testing its weight. "I've been reading about you. The firm had some reports on mid-market logistics tech come across the desk. Your name came up." "Good things, I hope," I said. "Very good things." A pause. She looked at the room for a moment, and in the look was something honest. I'll give her that. The honesty was genuine. "You look well." "I am well," I said. Another pause. "The kind that is content." "How long has it been?" she asked. "About 14 months, I said. She nodded. Whitney Chun was not a coward. I want to be clear about that, because what happened next required something that not everyone has. She asked if there was somewhere quieter. I said there was a small conference room off the lobby we hadn't opened to guests yet. She followed me to it. The chairs still had plastic on them. We hadn't fully transitioned the space. and I took the plastic off 2 chairs, and we sat across from each other under fluorescent light, which is not the most forgiving setting for either of us, and she looked at her hands for a moment, and then looked at me. I was wrong, she said. Not. I may have misjudged. Not. Things didn't work out the way I expected. Not the careful, hedged language of someone protecting themselves from full accountability. She said, I was wrong. About which part? I said, about the part that mattered, she said. About you. About what I thought you were and what you were capable of. She paused. I looked at where you were, and I decided it was where you were going. I didn't, she stopped. Started again. I was very focused on a particular definition of success, and you didn't fit it. And I convinced myself that meant you weren't going to succeed. Not that I defined success too narrowly. I sat with that. I think you're being honest, I said. I'm trying to be. I also think, I said, that it wasn't only about potential. I think you wanted something specific. A specific kind of life with a specific kind of person, and you were willing to build toward it. She looked at the table. Preston and I, she started. You don't have to, I said. It didn't, she stopped. It wasn't what I thought it would be. He was very good at being exactly the right kind of person in exactly the right kind of room, which turns out to be most of what he was. I didn't say anything. I'm not telling you that to make you feel better, she said quickly, or to ask for anything. I'm telling you because I think I owe you the full picture, and the full picture includes the fact that the thing I chose instead of you, she paused, was not the thing I thought I was choosing. The fluorescent light hummed very slightly. I appreciate you saying that, I said. But, she said. She heard the but that I hadn't spoken. But, I agreed. I don't think there's anywhere for this to go, Whitney. I don't think that's a door that opens again. She looked at me for a long moment. No, she said. I didn't really think it was. And then, quietly, I just needed to say it. I understood that. The need to say it. Not to change things, not to undo things, but to look squarely at the shape of your own mistake and name it out loud. There's a version of integrity that lives exactly there. I know, I said. She stood, smoothed her blazer, the gesture so familiar I felt it like a distant echo, moved toward the door. She turned back once. You should be proud of this, she said. I mean that. I am, I said. She nodded and left. I sat in that room for another 5 minutes. The plastic from the chair covers was on the table beside me, crinkled and formal. Outside, I could hear the event continuing, the specific murmur of a room full of people who are happy to be where they are. I wasn't angry. I noticed that specifically. I'd expected something, some residue of the old ache, and it was there. It's always there. It doesn't just vanish, but it was quiet. Like a note that's been played so many times it becomes background. I stood up, put the chairs back where they'd been, walked back out into the lobby. Derek handed me a drink as I rejoined the room. You okay? He said. Yeah, I said. He looked at me for a moment. You're okay, he said. Not a question. I'm okay, I agreed. 3 months later, Meridian closed a Series A that put us in a category no one had been sure we'd reach, including sometimes me. We hired 42 people over the following 6 months. The Brooklyn space became a secondary office, satellite for engineering and product, the kind of origin story you keep visible because it matters to remember where you started. The Manhattan headquarters, the lobby with the aluminum logo, became the thing I'd told Moira we weren't ready for. We were ready for it. Frank Belletti invited me to Hartwell's annual company dinner in the fall. I sat at the main table and talked to his family and ate reasonably well and felt, specifically and precisely, like a person who was exactly where they were supposed to be. Derek got promoted within Meridian, took on a COO role that fit him so exactly it seemed retrospectively obvious that this was what he should have been doing for years. Travis built a product team that 3 people from larger companies tried to poach over the following year. None of them left. Moira remained exactly as terrifying and effective as she'd always been. Chad texted me the day the Series A was announced with a message that was only the word "called it" in capital letters and a photo of the stock exchange for reasons I still don't fully understand. Whitney, I heard through professional overlap, had been promoted again. She was very good at her job. She was also, by various accounts, more careful now, more thoughtful about the difference between the performance of success and its substance. People said she was different. Whether that was true or just the story her community needed, I genuinely couldn't tell, and I'd made a decision, somewhere in the months after the headquarters opening, to stop trying to know. Preston, according to information I hadn't looked for but received anyway, was still in his expected place, with his expected connections, being exactly the right kind of person in exactly the right kind of room. Some people make a life of that. It's not nothing. It's just not what I wanted. Lindsay Park became a managing director. I read about it in a trade publication that Travis sent me with the note. Thought you'd find this interesting. I found it neutral, which felt like progress. Carrie, I never heard much about after that. Heidi either. They were always more supporting cast than principals, in the story as I understood it. The Bushwick studio, the one with the fire escape view, the rental white walls, the mattress that arrived 2 days after I moved in. I drove past it once in the fall, about a year after I'd left. I don't know why I went that way. I sat in the car and looked up at the 5th floor window and tried to remember the feeling of lying on the floor in the dark looking at the ceiling, and I could access the memory, but not the emotion underneath it. That's how you know you've moved. When the memory exists, but the wound doesn't. 6 months after the headquarters opening, I was walking out of the building late on a Thursday evening. The lobby lights had dimmed to their overnight setting, and the Meridian logo on the wall caught the reflection of the city outside. That Manhattan thing where the light comes from everywhere and nowhere. I stood there for a moment. Not because I needed to. Not because the moment called for ceremony. Just because I was there and the building was there and there was a single quiet second available before I walked back into the city. I thought about what Whitney had said in the conference room. I was wrong. And I didn't define success too narrowly. I tried to think about whether I'd said everything I should have said in return, and I decided, as I had decided before, that I had said exactly what was true. I thought about the Saturday morning in May, 14 months and some weeks earlier, in the apartment, and the ring box on the counter. I thought, I didn't feel angry. I didn't feel vindicated, either. That was the thing I'd expected to feel, at some level. The clean, satisfying click of the story landing where stories are supposed to land. The proof of something. The score settled. But it wasn't there. What was there was simpler than any of that. I just felt free. Free the way you feel when you've stopped carrying something heavy and you've been carrying it so long that you forgot what it felt like not to. And then one day you notice the weight is gone and your hands are empty and you can do whatever you want with them. I turned around, pushed through the glass door, walked out into the city. The same thing I had done 14 months earlier, on a May morning in the West Village, when I'd walked out of someone else's story without a plan or a destination or any idea what I was walking toward. Except this time, I knew exactly where I was going. And this time, I never looked back.